Picture this. It's 5 a.m. The sun hasn't even cracked the horizon yet. And instead of the gentle rustling of leaves that I've listened to every morning for 40 years, I'm jolted awake by the earth-shaking, mechanical roar of a bulldozer engine. I look out my window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I see this massive yellow beast tearing through the morning mist, its steel teeth poised to rip apart the very soul of my family's history. The woman directing this destruction, a woman we'll call Pamela Sterling, stands there in her pristine designer coat, holding a demolition permit with my signature on it. A signature I never signed, for a project I never approved, on land she doesn't even own. She thought she was just bulldozing a struggling farmer to make way for her luxury resort, assuming I was just another rural bumpkin she could crush with her wallet and her high-priced lawyers. But Pamela made a catastrophic error in judgment, the kind of mistake that ruins lives, because she didn't realize that the man she was trying to bury wasn't just a farmer. I am Alex Mercer, the Director of Land Use and Zoning for Pine Valley County. And for the last 15 years, I'm the guy who decides if a single shovel hits the dirt in this town. Standing there in the mud, breathing in the toxic mix of diesel fumes and the sweet, heartbreaking scent of crushed apple blossoms, I looked at the devastation behind me. Trees that my father, Robert, had planted with his own calloused hands 3 decades ago. Trees that were older than the corruption trying to kill them. It wasn't just about the apples, it was about the blood, sweat, and tears soaked into this soil. And as I watched Pamela smirk at me, unaware that she had just declared war on the one person who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, in the county archives, I realized this was going to be the fight of my life. But before we get to the FBI raids and the satisfaction of watching a criminal empire crumble, I need to back up and explain how a quiet apple orchard became ground zero for a federal racketeering case. My grandfather bought the Mercer Heritage Orchard back in the mid-90s when it was nothing but scrub brush and a wild dream, and when my dad passed away from a sudden heart attack in 2018, leaving me with mountains of medical debt and a choice between selling out or fighting to keep the lights on, I took a job with the county to pay the bills. It was ironic, really, me becoming a bureaucrat, the guy pushing papers and stamping permits, just to save a farm that represented everything the bureaucracy usually destroys. But it gave me a unique set of skills, a weaponized knowledge of the system that most people find boring until they need it to save their lives. Then came January, and with it came Pamela Sterling, a 52-year-old hurricane of entitlement fresh from Las Vegas, dragging a rolling suitcase full of lawsuits and an attitude that could curdle milk from 3 towns over. She moved into Silver Creek Heights, the upscale development bordering my land, and made it her personal crusade to turn our tight-knit community into her own private fiefdom. Within weeks, she was elected president of the Homeowners Association, and suddenly, the sound of her heels clicking on the pavement became the soundtrack of our nightmares. She was the type of person who moves next to an airport and complains about the planes, except in our case, she moved next to a 30-year-old working farm and filed noise complaints about the bees buzzing. She weaponized the HOA like a loaded gun, firing off violations left and right. Mrs. Higgins down the street got hit for the color of her curtains. The Miller family was fined for parking their truck in their own driveway. But her main target, her obsession, was me. It started small, a $15,000 remediation fee for my irrigation system, claiming it violated some obscure health code that hadn't been relevant since the Nixon administration. And when I demanded to see the paperwork, she slapped the document on the table with my signature at the bottom. I stared at that paper, the coffee turning to acid in my stomach, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had never seen that document in my life. That was the moment the fear set in, that cold, metallic taste of realizing you're dealing with someone who doesn't just bend the rules, but shatters them without a second thought. I sat at my kitchen table that night, Dad's old journals spread out next to stacks of legal threats, trying to figure out how someone could steal my identity so casually. Thankfully, I wasn't alone in the trenches. I had Sarah, my deputy clerk at the office who had a mind like a steel trap and could spot a fraudulent filing from across the room, and Big Tom, a local contractor who was already sick of Pamela trying to bully him into overcharging her neighbors. We started digging, and what Marcus, my cousin who works as a corporate attorney, found was terrifying. Pamela wasn't a novice. She was a serial predator who had run this exact same scam in Nevada and Arizona, targeting elderly landowners, drowning them in legal fees, and then buying their foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar to build strip malls. The pressure ramped up in March when men in sharp suits and dark sunglasses started surveying the perimeter of my land, their equipment humming like angry wasps, refusing to answer questions, and driving off in rentals with out-of-state plates. Then came the anonymous calls, the hushed voices telling me to sell now before accidents happened. But the breaking point, the moment that turned my fear into cold, hard rage, was finding out about the Sullivans. They were an elderly couple who had raised chickens next door for nearly 50 years, salt-of-the-earth people, until Pamela's HOA hit them with so many fines they were forced into bankruptcy proceedings, effectively erasing a lifetime of hard work in 3 months. I realized then that Pamela wasn't just a Karen. She was a cancer, eating away at the soul of our community, and if I didn't cut her out, she would consume us all. Then came the lawsuit, a 43-page masterpiece of fiction served to me at dawn, claiming my farm was illegal because the land had been zoned residential only since 1987. She produced an original zoning map to prove it, demanding immediate cessation of all farming and $250,000 in damages for hurting her property value. It looked like checkmate. It looked like the end. But remember, I'm the guy who memorizes zoning codes for fun. I spent 3 days in the basement of the Hall of Records, breathing in dust and desperation, until Sarah and I found the smoking gun. My farm was grandfathered in back in '94, rock solid. But more importantly, Pamela's evidence was a sloppy forgery. The map she submitted used section numbers that weren't created until 2003, and the county seal was missing a detail that was only added in the mid-90s, proving she hadn't just lied to the court, she had forged government documents, which is a federal crime. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the hunt, as I filed a countersuit that was less of a legal document and more of a declaration of war, attaching her forged map next to the real one. But I didn't stop there. I pulled the permits on her own mansion in Silver Creek Heights and found 17 code violations, from illegal deck extensions to septic issues. I scheduled a routine inspection for her property, and as I watched her turn pale, I knew I had drawn blood. But Pamela wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to escalate, and her retaliation was swift, vicious, and frankly, breathtakingly corrupt. 3 men claiming to be state agricultural inspectors showed up, declaring my trees were diseased and needed to be burned, flashing badges that looked like they were printed on an inkjet at a library. I watched from my porch, hidden cameras rolling, as our local health inspector, a sweaty, nervous guy named Inspector Jenkins, condemned my irrigation water, and then, in a moment that was almost too cinematic to be real, I filmed him walking over to Pamela's waiting Mercedes where she handed him a thick, white envelope. I captured the handshake, the exchange, the nod. It was bribery, clear as day, a felony caught in 4K resolution. But just as I thought I had the upper hand, Big Tom came to me with a set of blueprints he'd been asked to bid on, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just about the farm. The plans showed a massive, 200-room luxury resort spanning my land, the Sullivans' land, and the protected wetlands behind us. This was a premeditated, multi-million-dollar land grab involving organized crime money, and I was the only thing standing in the way. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Pamela Sterling wasn't just trying to get rid of a noisy neighbor. She was clearing the board for a casino-funded empire, and she had already designed the resort 6 months before she even moved into the neighborhood. I was staring at the blueprints on my kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands, realizing that she planned to use eminent domain to steal what 3 generations of Mercers had built. But while I was playing detective, Pamela decided to go nuclear, launching a personal destruction campaign that was terrifying in its efficiency. It started with a call from the IRS, informing me that my assets were frozen due to anonymous tips about kickbacks I was supposedly taking at the permit office, backed by doctored photos of me accepting cash, photos that were professionally faked. Suddenly, I couldn't pay my harvest crew, I couldn't buy fuel for the tractors, and the local paper, clearly on Pamela's payroll, ran a front-page story labeling me the corrupt king of zoning. My daughter called me from college in tears because people were harassing her online, calling her father a criminal, and my elderly mother was too terrified to answer the phone. It felt like the walls were closing in, like I was drowning in a sea of lies. But here's the thing about trying to frame an honest man. The truth has a nasty habit of fighting back. When the IRS investigators interviewed the contractors I supposedly extorted, every single one of them, including men who hated my guts for being a stickler for rules, told them I was the most annoyingly honest bureaucrat they'd ever met. Big Tom actually laughed in their faces, telling them I once made him redo a permit because the ink color was wrong. While the financial investigation stalled, I found the chink in Pamela's armor, and it was hidden in the details of her own greed. I was reviewing her latest permit application for a pool house, which was clearly the lobby for her future resort, and I noticed the property lines didn't match the GIS satellite data. She was claiming ownership of 2 extra acres, land that wasn't hers, land that was actually federally designated wetland. I drove out there at dusk, wading through the mud, and collected soil samples and photos of the Pine Valley tiger salamander, a federally endangered species living exactly where she planned to put her parking lot. That's when I stopped playing defense. I reached out to Agent Reyes from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who, it turned out, had been tracking Pamela's shell companies, Sterling Development, Desert Mirage Holdings, for months. They knew she was laundering mob money from Vegas, but they needed a local hook, undeniable proof of racketeering on the ground, and I handed them a silver platter piled high with forged permits, bribed inspectors, and environmental crimes. Agent Reyes told me to sit tight, to let Pamela think she was winning, to let her hang herself with her own arrogance. And oh, did she get arrogant. Thinking she had crushed me, Pamela accelerated her timeline. She tried to bribe the county sheriff, unaware that he was recording the entire conversation. She hired thugs to slash my tires and smash the Sullivan's mailbox, leaving a trail of evidence so sloppy it led right back to her rental car agency. But the real mini twist came when I discovered a clause in her original purchase agreement for Silver Creek Heights. Her funding was contingent on breaking ground by October 15th. If she missed that date, her investors, the kind of guys who break kneecaps for sport, would pull the plug and come collecting. She was desperate, bleeding cash, and terrified. So, she tried one last, desperate Hail Mary. At 3 a.m. on October 12th, 3 days before her deadline, the night exploded with noise. Pamela had brought in an unlicensed, out-of-state demolition crew to clear the wetlands under the cover of darkness, bypassing all permits, claiming emergency flood control. I stood on my porch, watching ancient oaks topple in the floodlights, feeling a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. But I didn't run out there with a shotgun. I picked up the phone. As the permits director, I have the authority to issue immediate stop work orders for environmental violations. I called the EPA emergency hotline. I called the sheriff, and by sunrise, federal agents were swarming the property. Pamela tried to spin it, her PR team flooding social media with bots claiming I was an anti-progress extremist costing the town jobs. But Elena Rossi, an investigative journalist we've been working with, was ready. She had been compiling a dossier on Pamela's trail of destruction across 4 states, interviewing families who had lost everything to her scams. We coordinated everything for the day of the groundbreaking ceremony. Pamela thought she was going to be crowned queen of the county. Instead, she was walking into a trap set by the very people she tried to destroy. The tension in the days leading up to the 15th was suffocating. I was living under federal protection. Big Tom was patrolling the orchard with a shotgun, and the community was on edge. But we held the line. We knew that if we could just get her on stage, on record, claiming ownership of that federal land, it would be the final nail in her coffin. The morning of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear, the air smelling of apples and justice. Pamela had set up a stage right on the edge of my property, a golden shovel gleaming in the sun, unaware that half the audience were FBI agents in plain clothes. The atmosphere at the groundbreaking ceremony was electric, but not for the reasons Pamela Sterling thought. She stood at the podium, draped in a suit that cost more than my tractor, beaming that fake, polished smile at a crowd of investors, bought-off politicians, and local media. She looked like a conqueror surveying her new kingdom, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath her feet was about to open up. She launched into her speech, her voice shrill and confident, talking about overcoming the obstruction of corrupt locals and bringing a new era of prosperity to Pine Valley. I stood at the back, flanked by Elena Rossi and Big Tom, feeling the weight of the wire taped to my chest. It was time. As she opened the floor for questions, expecting softballs from her planted reporters, I stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder high in the air. The silence that fell over the crowd was heavy, instantaneous. "I have a question about the permits, Ms. Sterling." I projected, my voice steady. You could see the color drain from her face, but she tried to maintain the charade. "Mr. Mercer," she hissed, "this is hardly the time." I didn't let her finish. "These applications contain 47 documented false statements," I announced, walking toward the stage, "including your claim to own 2 acres of federally protected wetlands that belong to the people of the United States." I motioned to Elena, who projected the GIS maps onto a screen we had set up, showing the undeniable red lines of the property boundaries versus Pamela's fraudulent blueprints. The crowd gasped. The investors started shifting uncomfortably. Pamela's mask cracked. She screamed into the microphone, "This is harassment. I have federal approval. I have the environmental clearance right here." She waved a piece of paper, the report from the bribed Inspector Jenkins. That was the moment. That was the confession. Agent Reyes stepped out from the crowd, badge glinting in the autumn sun. "That report is evidence of bribery, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "And you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and violations of the Federal Clean Water Act." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the sweetest melody I had ever heard, louder than the applause that erupted from the neighbors, louder than the sobs of the Sullivan family who were finally seeing justice. Pamela was dragged away, still screaming about conspiracies, while her investors scattered like roaches when the lights turn on, only to be intercepted by federal marshals waiting at the perimeter. The aftermath was swift and brutal for them, but healing for us. Pamela pleaded guilty to avoid a 25-year sentence, taking a plea deal for 12 years in federal prison and millions in restitution. The corrupt officials, including Inspector Jenkins, were swept out of office and faced their own charges. The Silver Creek Heights HOA was dissolved by court order, freeing the neighborhood from her tyrannical grip. But the best part? The federal government seized the assets of Pamela's shell companies. 6 months later, the Mercer Heritage Orchard didn't just survive, it expanded. We used the restitution funds to restore the wetlands Pamela had damaged, and the county officially designated the area as the Mercer-Sullivan Nature Preserve, ensuring that no developer could ever touch it again. I stood there yesterday, watching school kids on a field trip learning about the tiger salamander in the very pond Pamela tried to pave over, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Elena and I are together now. Trauma bonding turns out to be a great foundation for a relationship, and we're working on a book about the whole ordeal. But as I sit here on my porch, watching the sun set over the apple trees that are finally safe, I'm left with a lingering question. I was lucky. I had the knowledge, the position, and the connections to fight back. But what happens to the people who don't? What happens when the next Pamela Sterling comes to a town where the zoning director isn't a stubborn apple farmer? It makes you wonder, how much of progress is built on the ruins of someone else's life, stolen with a fountain pen and a smile? If someone tried to bulldoze your legacy for profit, how far would you go to stop them? Would you trust the system, or would you burn it down to save your home? Let me know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the little guy bites back. Stay safe, and always check your property lines.